This is Rex from universalexports.co, bringing you a fortnightly podcast called A Story to Tell. In this series, we hear from an eclectic group of people whose only connection is through being a member of the Camberwell Petong Club. By research, gentle prodding and sometimes coercion, these guests unfold a labyrinth of achievements, disappointments and surprises. You may be inspired, shocked or even doubtful, but you will be enthralled because everyone has a story to tell. You wouldn't think it from his quiet, gentle demeanour, but today's guest has an unmatched and outstanding career in the world of aviation. In particular, helicopters. He is the holder of the first commercial ATPL helicopter licence in this country. He wrote the rules. He has over 147 endorsements for different aircraft on his licence, including many jet types. He won the Queen's Commendation for his bravery in extracting a pilot from a crashed, burning aircraft. He has claimed to a never-to-be-repeated achievement at Tullamarine Airport. And he is also renowned for his incredible duck fat roast potatoes. But there is so much more. In fact, so much more. We are presenting his audiobook on this site after the interview. Let me introduce John Cameron Ross, Gentleman Pilot. Good morning, John. Thank you so much for your time being here, contributing to this. Of all the things that you've done, and you've done so much over your aviation career, but it all started because you used to warm up a toilet seat for some corporal.
Well, that was involved. I was a Duntroon cadet for 4 years. The corporal, his father was a politician. Nice guy, as it turned out, but it was the era of bastardisation in Royal Military College, and it was a tough upbringing. But through that, I got a scholarship to get a private pilot's licence in my last year at Duntroon. That's ultimately how I started my career as a pilot.
But your very first flight in a powered aircraft, which probably inspired you, was in 1950 when you were in a Butler air transport aircraft.
Yeah, I was a schoolboy, and the Butlers used to fly between Sydney and Dubbo, and I had relatives that lived about 60 miles out of Dubbo, and my parents had booked me a flight on a DC-3, the regular public transport flight, and that was my first exposure to flying, and that's where I really got a kick out of the whole thing.
So you got into Duntroon, you got this scholarship to get involved in aircraft. Your evaluation flight was in an Oster.
That's correct. At Duntroon in your final year, you were given an option to try for a scholarship. I did. I think there were 30 other cadets applied also, but they selected 5. I was one of the 5. The Army gave the contract to a company called Kingsford Smith Flying School, which was run by 2 ex-World War II Polish soldiers who didn't speak good English. And they came up and brought 2 Osters up, and that's when I did my first flying.
You soloed in 1957.
Yep, I was still a cadet at Duntroon.
You did that in a few short hours, didn't you?
About par for the course. I think I'd flown 4 or 5 hours, and he let me go solo. But not to carry passengers. I was a student pilot. When I did about 42 hours, he did a test for me, a flight test, and I was awarded a private pilot licence.
You mentioned that you weren't able to take passengers until later on, until you were qualified.
Yep.
One of your first passengers was a friend you took up with you.
He's another cadet.
But you weren't trying to impress him, you were trying to impress a girlfriend. What happened on that flight?
Well, we flew out. I had a grand total of about 2 hours as an approved pilot, a captain. Took him for a flight. He was also a cadet. We went out to the farmhouse where my late wife, who at that stage was my girlfriend, I did a low-level circuit, which went hopelessly wrong, turned too swiftly, and both me and my passenger lurched to one side and the window of the Oster, which was pretty much jerry-built, fell out. And so I had to return to the instructor without a window. I told him some story about hitting turbulence, but I knew where the window was. Got a Jeep, drove out, found the window, which had been picked up by my friend and my late wife, took it back, and we were all friends again. Everyone thought how marvellous it was I could find it after losing a window from the plane in the bush.
And for those people that don't know what an Oster is, compared to an aircraft nowadays, they were very, very basic aircraft, weren't they?
Extremely basic, yeah. 2 seats, pilot and a passenger, fabric-covered airframe, very small engine, underpowered, and quite difficult to fly by today's standards.
And that underpowering and probably lack of power resulted in an incident that you had prior to you going solo, when you had an incident with a poultry farm.
I did. Fortunately, I wasn't the pilot. My instructor was the pilot. We had lost an engine.
And you only have one engine.
We had one engine. And we were outside of Bankstown, and he decided that the nearest place we could put down was in a poultry farm. There must have been, to my mind, there were 50,000 chooks, but probably there's only about 500 of them. But we landed in the middle of them, and the farmer was not happy. I think the egg-laying quota for the week got severely disrupted.
The Osters that you were talking about had gained somewhat of a reputation because one had taken off without a pilot.
Yes, yeah, that would certainly be in the press records. It was a big thing in Sydney. The pilot landed, as you do when you're landing, you have the trim set for a nose-up landing. And as he landed, the engine stalled, just stopped because he'd had the throttle closed down. So he got out. There was no self-starter in the Osters, so he, in the middle of Bankstown Airport, he left the aircraft. There was no radio, so the tower gave him a green light, and he went to the front of the plane, cranked the engine. It roared to life and started to move forward. He didn't have time to get back into the cockpit, so he hung onto the tail for about 100 metres and then had to let that go. And the Oster by itself was trimmed for takeoff. It just roared into the air, and it had about an hour and a half of fuel on board. It headed over Sydney, and it was doing big circuits, probably a mile and a half. It circuited Sydney a couple of times. The police, the press were aware of it. They didn't know where it was going to crash, which it would have done as soon as it ran out of fuel. Fortunately, it just got past the quay and ditched into the water there without injury, and it was certainly the end of the Oster, though.
At some stage, the Army liaised with the RAF.
Yeah, the Army decided that it wanted its own tactical aircraft. At that stage, the only aircraft they had was about 4 Osters that the artillery were flying, the artillery officers, so they had about 6 or 7 pilots, and they used it for gunnery spotting. The Army wanted it for reconnaissance, general reconnaissance and general use, and they convinced the Department of Army that they could start up an Army wing, which involved, from memory, 6 Cessnas, fixed wing, and 6 Bell 47 helicopters. And from that they took volunteers from the Army, from all arms, infantry, gunnery, service, engineering, and I was one of those. They initially sent them to Point Cook for the Air Force to train them as basic pilots, just for the basis. And then they came to Amberley, where the Army had set up their own training school to qualify them for Army pilots, which was a step beyond what the Air Force had done.
And this is where you did a conversion to helicopters?
Yes.
And your favourite helicopter?
Was the Bell 47.
And how many other helicopters were there about, other types?
Bell, no others, that was it.
That was it?
The Navy had a few. I think they had 6 Sycamores down at Nowra. The Navy kept pretty much to themselves, and it was a bit of a secret what they did with their Sycamores, because they were single-engine aircraft as well.
So I take it forces didn't necessarily get along terribly well.
Well, The Air Force believed that they were entitled to do the flying. They accepted that the Navy had a case to answer because of their deck landings they did on aircraft carriers and so forth, but they were not happy about the Army running their own little Air Force. And so they tried politically to shut it down, but that was just Defence Forces arguments. The end result was that the Army were given approval to run their own specific aviation requirement.
After you converted to helicopters, one of the jobs you got involved with was searching for Rockefeller. How did that come about?
I was a line pilot, probably I'd look it up, but not a very experienced pilot, probably 500 hours. Michael Rockefeller was an erratic member of the Rockefeller family, Nelson Rockefeller. He was in Irian Jaya, which is now West Papua, Indonesia, headhunter territory, and he was doing research. He went out on a canoe with 3 locals to go between mud banks, looking and doing his research. Storm came up, tore the canoe apart. The 2 natives on board swam to shore and in 3 days made contact with the authorities to research, and a search was made for Michael Rockefeller, who was last seen hanging onto the canoe, and he was never sighted again since. So the American asked the Australian government if they could assist, and the Australian government sent 2 of our Bell 47s to Irian Jaya. It was a 3-day ferry flight to get the machines up there. The Navy brought in some fuel for us and we searched for about 3 days, but it was clearly a hopeless task. There was no sign of Rockefeller found.
Given who he was, that must have been a big deal in the papers worldwide.
It was. I've still got press cuttings of it here, but it was quite sensational. There were 2 pilots per helicopter, so 4 pilots. We all got very well appreciated letters from Nelson Rockefeller after the event.
You've had a few incidents with helicopters, but that's not surprising, seeing the amount of time that you spent in them. You had an incident where you could smell fuel on a helicopter flight.
Right.
What did you discover the cause was that, and were you able to fix it?
Yeah, I remember that very well. I was with another pilot. In fact, it could well have been on the trip we were going up for Rockefeller, but one of us, and I think it was him, but he thought it was me, didn't put the fuel cap on correctly. At about 2,000 feet over jungle, we could smell fuel. I turned around and I saw the fuel being siphoned out of the starboard fuel tank because the fuel cap hadn't been correctly connected. And since it was on my side, I was the only person that could get out and sideways move down the skids of the helicopter, holding onto the side of the helicopter, and reset the fuel tank cover. There was just jungle below us and nowhere we could set the chopper down.
And no safety line, I take it?
No safety line, nothing. No, the seatbelt didn't extend that far.
Only you and your dry cleaner know how exciting that was.
One of those things of life that you don't forget.
You were able to put it back on and continue to fly?
Yeah, we lost a bit of fuel. I think we siphoned a few, probably about 5 litres, but we had enough to get down on the beach and radio for someone to come in.
Not long after that, you were attached to the US Army.
Yes, that was Alabama, Fort Rucker. The deal was, since the American Army were well ahead of any other Allied army, including the Brits, they had been using helicopters quite extensively, and the Australian Army made a deal that I'd be attached to them for 18 months with family. So I moved to Fort Rucker.
And the whole family moved over with you?
Yeah, my wife and 1 child at that stage. The Americans did a great job. They gave me exposure to all sorts of skill, low-flying skills, instrument flying, gunnery, the whole thing. And it was the start of my aviation career, really.
And this is where one of the choppers you were in touched a power line?
Yeah. Well, I saw the power line come across. I was flying at about 90 knots, I suppose, in a barren area of Texas. Suddenly looked up, and amongst all the cactuses was this power line ahead of me. And I had a decision to make to go under the power line or above it. It's amazing how quickly you can think. And I figured if I went above it, I'd get my skids caught in it. There's probably 12 feet gap below the power lines, and I reckon I could get below it. So I dumped the nose down, but of course that brought the rotor blades up, and as I went under it, I did feel a a bit of a gig, and the tips had hit the power lines. And fortunately, it skidded. The blades were underneath rather than on above the power lines. I landed, saw the scratch marks on the rotor blades where it hit. That was it.
So it was still flyable?
Yeah, still flyable.
You got
Shut
it back?
it down, had a look at it. But the tips were severely damaged, and I've got one of them here at home as a memento.
Who was it that gave you those?
Yeah, when I graduated, as a bit of light relief, I said some nice things about the Australian friends and how they enjoyed my company and how well I did and so forth. But as a gift, they're going to give me, as they do in the bullfights, instead of giving me the ears of the bull, I get the tips of the rotor blade that got damaged.
You had another situation there.
It was a big helicopter, an H-34, which was I think 16-passenger chopper, and a side door, and it was in the States, and we were returning on a ferry flight. There were myself and another pilot up in the cockpit, which was a fair way up, about 4 stairs where the cockpit was, and below we had our maintenance guy who'd been with us for the 3 days. It was hot, extremely hot, and he'd laid out some seats so he could sleep in the back, and he'd opened the side door, which was a big cargo door. So he was about 4 feet from the door, asleep on the seats, and we were up on the top flying the aircraft. Suddenly the pilot ops me to break up the boredom. He said, exercise, you've got a forced landing, and he turned the throttle off, which meant that I had to immediately go into an auto rotation because the power had stopped going to the engine. You had to be very quick about it, so you had to drop the aircraft, which free fell for about, 50 feet till we got into an auto rotation. And in doing so, I put it on about a 90-degree turn to swivel round to make the practice emergency landing and a clearing I just passed. But in the turn, at 90 degrees, we heard this shriek, and of course this poor bastard that was asleep found him on a 90-degree sideways turn. He rolled off the seats and heading for the open doorway. So he wasn't impressed, and he told us. And as a corporal, I think I was a major and the other pilot was a captain or a major, he didn't hold back.
And that's an incident he won't forget.
That's right, yeah. We had a few beers that night. He was okay afterwards.
Whilst you were there was a political situation involving Governor Wallace. He wanted to quell the rioters. They were going to get you guys to do it.
Yeah, there was a racial unrest in Alabama at those days. It was caused by a coloured guy. His name was Meredith, and he was the first coloured guy to go to this ultra-white university at Old Mississippi. They had to bring the police. As I recall, the state police were not helpful, so they called the military and American military to allow this guy to be brought into the university. And it was a lot of social unrest, a lot of rioting. They were going to spray the rioters with tear gas, and I was on roster duty. The embassy got to hear of it. I told them that I'm getting involved in riot activities down there. Are they happy with that? And they certainly weren't, so I got pulled off the job at the last minute.
Which is very, very fortunate.
Very politically.
What a situation to put you in.
Yeah.
You got back to Australia in December 1963 as a senior flying instructor, and you did helicopter conversions. That meant bringing the whole family back again. Where were you based when you got back?
Amberley Air Force Base, and I spent offhand, I'd say about 5 years up there. I had 2 more children born.
Amberley, that's in
Queensland.
How many children have you got at this stage?
4. 4 was it. We kept that.
So you weren't that busy flying helicopters?
No, I only had 2 while I was up there. The others came later.
As a good PR gesture for children with polio, they had a special day or special festivities, and you were going to do an amazing fish act.
Yeah. Well, my wife was a bit of an artist. She painted the bubble up with a big face and a bulbous nose. People from the maintenance designed a 3-ply hat, which I put on top of the bubble, and a bow tie around the front of it. All totally unapproved by the authorities.
And sounds like it was unaerodynamic as well.
Well, no, it was okay. It was okay to fly. We tested it, but I had to ferry it from Amberley down to Brisbane, where the Christmas party was for disadvantaged kids. And over Ipswich, there was this terrible bang, and the boater hat, which was been put on the bubble, came loose of its rigging and flew into the tail rotor, which of course is the end of a flight as far as choppers are concerned. So I went into auto rotation, called a mayday, and there was a game of cricket being played over Ipswich, and I made for the cricket pitch. Of course, this helicopter bubble was painted with a big face and gashed teeth and bow tie and everything, and these cricketers looked up and saw this thing approaching them, and I don't know who was the most surprised, them or me, that I safely put it down, fortunately.
Without hitting any cricketers.
No, without a cricketer. They took off.
That's a day they'll never forget it.
Me either, I can tell you.
And nobody was injured.
No one injured, no damage to the chopper.
But surely you would have had to put in a report and do some explanation.
We didn't have to do that. The press were on it within 5 minutes. We got some good photos of it.
On a more serious incident that happened, at an air show in November 1964, Charles Miller was in a Cessna and you were in a chopper.
It was a serious incident. Charles was to do a bit of a low-level burst around the air show, which was being held up in Ipswich. He was to do his 2 minutes of drama, if you call it that, with a Cessna. I was to follow with some auto rotations and some manoeuvres with the helicopter. So I'm watching him do his thing and I'm ready to go into my act. And what he did was to do a climb, a run along the airport, did a steep climb, a turn, and come down and land from that. And he misjudged it, and when he turned and was coming down, he only had about 300 feet and he was vertical. And he dragged the nose up but hit the tarmac, burst into flames, badly damaged. And we're in the middle of the airport, so there was no crash vehicle within a minute. You know, they had to get things lined up. So I landed by the chopper. It was only 100 yards from where I was. 2 local farmers grabbed a hose and started to run onto the airport, and I got inside. Charles was unconscious, but I got his...
You got inside the Cessna?
Yeah, it was upside down on fire. He was unconscious, so I undid his strap, yelled out to these farmers that had a hose quite near the fence to laid the hose on us all and dragged him out. It probably didn't do his back any good, but he lived through it.
He did?
Yes, he lived through it, and I don't think he flew again.
For that incredible deed that you did, you received special commendation.
I got a Queen's commendation.
Well, congratulations.
A long time ago. I probably wouldn't do it today.
Not long after that, in 1965, you joined DCA as an airways surveyor and examiner.
Well, I was planning to leave the military anyway. They advised me that they were promoting me and I was to go back into the corps that I originally came from, that I was finished with flying. I'd had 7 years, I think, and they wanted me to get back to a career of straight military, which didn't suit me. And at this very time, the Department of Civil Aviation put an ad in the paper for helicopter pilots to apply for the job as an examiner of airmen, which meant testing pilots for pilot licence. They didn't have one at that stage, and there were only about 11 helicopters in Australia, but it was clearly a growing concern.
You really were one of the very first helicopters in this country.
Yeah, apart from, as I say, the Navy had a little Carter off Nowra, but...
So do you remember your helicopter licence number?
I do.
Is it number 11?
Well, that was my airline transport licence. It was number 11 for helicopters. The only other helicopter pilots were from Department of Civil Aviation who had a limited number of hours. I'm not sure how they gave licences before I got there. I think they had an ex-Air Force wing commander who'd retired, and he flew helicopters overseas, and they used to get him on a contract basis to test people. But there were only a handful of licensed helicopter pilots then, but more coming. So my job was to write the book of rules on helicopter operations, because that hadn't been done in Australia. That was 50% of my work, and the other 50% was to test applicants when they wanted a licence. And so I used to fly with them, and if they could do a power-off landing and handle the helicopter okay, I gave them a licence. But there were very few choppers around those days, I think 7 or 8 in the country.
This also got you involved in accident investigations because you were the sole helicopter specialist for DCA in all of Australia and Papua New Guinea. Did that keep you busy?
Not too busy. As I say, there weren't that many helicopters around, and when they did crash, unless there was injuries, the department didn't have the resource. There were a number of serious ones. I was usually involved in working with the Accident Investigation Board as a specialist to give them my thoughts on the matter.
And when that happened, did this involve more rewriting of regulations?
Oh yeah, addressing the regulations. A lot of them were caused by the pilots not adhering to the regulations, such as they were in those days.
Whilst you were with DCA, you became endorsed on an Aero Commander.
That was fixed wing, and the department had an Aero Commander in each region, New South Wales, Victoria, West Australia, for their own communication travel, where they send their fixed wing examiner of airmen out to check on aero clubs and so forth. So they endorsed me on that so that I could go and do the same thing in stations or wherever in Australia. I'd go and get the regional Aero Commander and visit an operation, do the licence test.
You'd be knocking up a few hours in fixed wing as well as helicopters by this stage. In that Aero Commander, you had a situation where you had to use a spoon. What happened there, John? Is that something you want to talk about?
Not really, no. That was in Queensland. I was flying with the Queensland Senior Examiner of Airmen, who was a cranky bastard, World War II fellow. I wouldn't say we didn't get on, but he was pretty strict. Anyway, we were flying back in the Aero Commander, just the two of us. It was my turn to do the flight leg, but it was getting to be dusk. We landed, and I did a U-turn to get off the runway, and the aircraft bogged down in the sand. And he was apoplectic. He just could not believe it. And we had no spade. There was no one on the airport. It was completely deserted. Night was setting in. And the only thing we had was a spoon in the... He said, get to work. Get that sand out of the nose so we can get this thing flying. Anyway, I think I must have worked for 20 minutes with a spoon, and I must have got at least 2 or 3 buckets of sand out of that and we finally got the nose wheel clear, and I'll never forget it. And he was an ex-Air Force, of course, who hated ex-Army pilots.
At that same Aero Commander, you had a run-in with a couple of live crayfish.
Well, on one of my trips down to Tasmania, if they knew I was going down to do a licence check or a pilot check or something, the other examiners all put in orders for crayfish, because I'd stop on the way, King Island, I think, or Flinders Island, and buy straight from boats from very cheap. But they were live crayfish. And I bought I think I must have been guessing about 80 kilos of crayfish in 2 big Hessian sacks, put them in the back of the plane. I was solo, taking the aircraft down to do the job, and on the way back, I felt something scratch my ankle when I was flying. I looked down. The cords of one of these big sacks, 40-litre sacks of live crayfish had opened up, and these bloody crayfish were heading from the back of the aircraft up to the cockpit. And this crayfish, I don't know where he thought he was going, but he was going to get into the pedals. So I spent half the time flying the plane, the other half throwing crayfish back into the back of the aircraft again. It brought everybody to tears of laughter afterwards, because it had a happy ending.
But it could have been disastrous.
It could have been a disaster.
I wouldn't have liked to have written that report.
No. I would have gone down with the aircraft, I think.
You were still with DCA when we lost one of our Prime Ministers.
Harold Holt. He went in, I got a call, I think it was a Sunday. They wanted a helicopter. I got the Ansett helicopter, flew down there.
You got the Ansett helicopter?
Well, we didn't own it. We had to borrow a helicopter, and I think it was the Ansett one, but the department didn't own anyone. Being a Sunday, we had to try and find one, and I think it was the one that Ansett used to use to run himself out to Reg Ansett.
Been in that?
Have you? Well, there you go.
Twice.
Anyway, Holt went down in an area, it was quite deep, I think a couple of 100 feet, and it was very, very thick kelp, yeah. They never found the body. There's nothing much the chopper could do. I think it was more an expectation that it was the only chopper there, but they had boats, they got a boat out there, but the divers had great trouble getting through the kelp, and nothing was heard of Holt after that.
In about 1969, or you left Department of Civil Aviation, but just before you did, you have gained an indisputable win that nobody else can do, and that was you landed the first aircraft at Tullamarine Airport.
That's right. It sounds better than it was. The airport was to open on a particular day, let's say it was a Wednesday. They asked me if I could go in there on Tuesday with a couple of photographers. So being a helicopter, I didn't have to break any bands or anything there, so I flew in there and landed on the end of the runway. But that was technically the first aircraft landing on Tullamarine.
And no one can take that away from you, John. That's excellent. You left there and you started to get into the commercial world with Esso.
Esso had just started Bass Strait, and their first platform was Barracuda, about 50 miles offshore. And they had a press day. I think there was about 30 or 35 press people from around Australia were being shown over the oil platform. On this particular day, the press asked if the pilot of the helicopter that took them out there would fly around the platform so they could get some photographs, and he said yes. So I think 7 press people got into the chopper, which was a 13-passenger one. And a lot of other press people came up to get photographs of them in the chopper, which was a pretty stupid thing to do, to be on a platform, a very restricted platform when there's a chopper flying. Anyway, they did it and they stayed around the edge, and when the chopper came in for landing, the tail rotor failed and the chopper immediately started to spin. The pilot did a good job, planted it straight back on the deck, but it had rubber floats and they was kind of adhesive to the anti-skid deck, and the undercarriage gave away and the helicopter rolled on its side. The blades shattered obviously when they hit the deck, and killed a number of the press people and badly injured the others. So I got a call from the department to get out there and help the exit investigators. And that's when Esso got to know me and I got to know them. I was up there for about 4 days. They realised that they didn't have a technical person, and they had all these helicopters working around the rigs, and they definitely need someone to write some standards. So they made an offer too good to refuse. They said, would you come and work for us? You know, their big company, Esso Australia, was part of the Humble and Exxon. So I talked it over with my wife, and they obviously offered an awful lot of more than I was getting with the government, and the job sounded very interesting. The downside was I had to cover their worldwide operations, so I did a lot of travelling, which was hard on my wife, hard on the family, but it worked out for the best.
It must have done, because you spent 27 years with them.
Yeah, I retired and then came back as a consultant. But I was based in Australia, but Exxon was a worldwide operation, so I did an awful lot of travelling. Russia, China, North Sea, Norway, South Africa, a lot of travel.
Whilst you're with them, you've said the most demanding flight that you ever did was in October 1969 off Longford. There was a crew member on a ship and he had appendicitis.
It was a Russian vessel, actually, that was coming up from the south, heading up towards Sydney. We got a call from the maritime people saying that there's a deckhand that's suffering a seizure. It's bad weather, they can't get a boat alongside, and is anything SOBHP could do. We used to get a number of these, and I think for public relations, SOBHP went along with it if the police supported the request. You know, it would have been bad publicity if they knocked something like that back. So I got a call. It was daylight, but it was fog virtually down to the seabed. I think there must have been about 20 feet before the fog gave away. It was not right on the water, but it started about 150 feet above the sea. So I said, well, I don't think I can do anything about it to the vessel. I can't get there, but I'll give it a try. So I went. I had a medic with me, and I entered cloud. Zero just went on instruments immediately, and being a helicopter, I could vary the descent speed quite closely. The altimeter was not good enough to give me accurate depths. I just went down, just as I said to the guy that was sitting in the co-pilot seat, I said, we can't see a thing, I'm within 30 feet of the seabed. It was flat calm, I knew that because of the fog. I said, we're going to have to give this away. Just as I did, I saw a hawsail coming out of the sea, going off at an angle of about 30 degrees from me, and I realised it was one of the anchor points for the rig. So I just put it a few feet in front of the cockpit and followed it up, and there was the deck of the thing, got on there. Got the guy out, the Russian who was supposed to be suffering from appendicitis, and it was that alcoholic poisoning, he'd been drinking, and he was unconscious. So it was a bit of a drama all around. Anyway, getting home was no trouble. I just lifted off through the fog, got into blue sky and took him back.
Some of the other weird situations, you had to go out to Flinders Island to assess a landing area. You were walking around this place and you couldn't see anybody, but you felt that you were being looked at.
Right down on the tip of the mainland, little airport. Anyway, I was at this airport and I was preparing to do a trip over there, and I think this aircraft was also. But when I looked at it, there was no pilot. The door was open, and I saw the pilot. And then he was about 200 metres away, but I looked at these people all sitting there dead quiet, and they seemed to have sunglasses on. Anyhow, I went over, and it was 6 sheep in 6 passenger chairs, and this guy had to fly them to Flinders Island. He was a bit embarrassed because they were sitting, he'd strapped them in on the seats. He said, I had no freighter. So he had these big sheep strapped in each in their own seat, each with a seatbelt around them, and he'd put like sunglasses on their head so they couldn't see out and couldn't panic. And it was the strangest sight to see 6 sheep looking at me, baying. Anyway, this guy came up and he was a bit embarrassed. He said, I had to get him out somehow.
Goodness.
But the other one, yeah, it was when I was with ESSO, the government had this remote lighthouse way down the bottom of the very tip, of the southern tip. I forget the name of the lighthouse, but very difficult to get to, and they had no choppers of their own, and they did a deal with SOBHP that every month or so they'd lease a helicopter for a day work, and we'd fly down to the lighthouse and do urgent food changes or medical changes or something. And I landed there, and I was in the lighthouse. The technician I'd brought in was off with the lighthouse keeper, so I was sitting down with the lighthouse keeper's wife. Barren place, you got no idea. And she was chatting, and I said, I'd heard of mutton birds. You've got mutton birds. She said, oh, we've got thousands of mutton birds. She said, do you know anything about mutton birds? And I said, not much. And she told me about them, and they're very interesting little birds. They birth there. As they mature, their parents stuff them full of plankton or whatever little mutton birds have, and they put enough of this stuff in their bellies. They can't fly at this stage. They've got food and they've got to learn to fly, and their parents have head off and head up the northern hemisphere. So they've got these little mutton birds that haven't gone solo in flight. They've got to teach themselves, and they've got 5 or 7 days worth of food in their stomach.
Right.
And she said, but, you know, it's terrible. A lot of them don't make it. And I said, oh, really? I mean, that's terrible. As a pilot, I thought, that's a hard way to break loose. And she said, yeah. And she said, I'd try and help them. And she said, come and have a look. So we went down the path, and these little fluffy birds are galloping down the path, flapping their wings. Most of the time they didn't make it. They get to the end of the path and stop and turn around and plod back and have another crack at it. And she said, and I try and help them. And I said, how do you do that? And she said, well, I pick them up and I throw them, at least get them in the air. And she said, I'll show you. And there must have been about a 20-knot wind blowing. And so she picked one of these poor little guys up and threw it downwind. And of course, you know, didn't have a hope. It just did a couple of cartwheels and flopped on the ground again. And I said, my goodness, what are you doing? She said, what do you mean? I said, you're throwing it the wrong way. And she said, no, I'm throwing it downwind so they get a bit of a start. And I said, as a pilot, that's not the way to do it. You've got to throw it into wind. And she said, oh no, that wouldn't work. And I said, give it a go. And she did, and it took off. This little bird went up flapping away, and there it did. It dropped a few feet, and then away it went. And I reckon I saved hundreds of lives on that little eket.
John, one of the first stories I remember told me not long after I joined Camberwell Baton Club, you were ferrying a very large Sikorsky helicopter from the UK to Australia. You had to take cash with you because it's the only way to buy fuel, and it involved about $8,000.
We were given, I forget right now how much it was. It was in the order of 8,000. It had to be cash because there was a fuel shortage at that time. And to ferry this chopper, it was a big Sikorsky, they had two pilots. It was Bristow helicopters. They had two pilots, two captains, and a mechanic. And they'd pulled out the inside of the chopper and put, I think, a 2,000 litre auxiliary fuel tank in there to help with the ferry flight. We each carried the cash. It was divided up, and I think we had about $4,000 or $5,000 each. And I always got rid of mine first. So before we'd really left Europe, we were paying cash to gas up the chopper. When it came to almost the last, it was in Greece somewhere. He went to pay, I won't give you his name, but it was his turn to pay for the fuel. I saw by his face that something had gone horribly wrong. He was pulling his bag apart. And he said, I've got some bad news. And I said, what? Well, both the other pilot and myself said, what's the problem? And he said, I've lost the money. And what had happened, the night before, we were in some god-awful little village. He remembered taking his money, which was in the sealed envelope of about $4,000 to $8,000 or whatever it was US, and putting it under the mattress. And the next morning, it's still there. He'd forgotten all about it. And it was his turn to pay. And by this time, we had to get special approval to fly through these countries. There was no way we were going to turn around this ferry flight. So they wired him some cash up to the place, and as far as I know, there's an envelope with about $8,000 of small bills. But you know, the cost of trying to get the chopper back would be several $1,000s to start with. And I don't think it would have helped if we wrote to them and said, "Could you see if there's an envelope under the mattress?"
But that Sikorsky was a big aircraft.
It was 20-odd seats. They had two in Australia, one or two in Australia, running out to Hayman Island from Proserpine. Twin-engine chopper. It was very slow, very cumbersome. I think the President of the United States used to fly around in one.
Did you put an antenna in the middle of the city somewhere?
In Melbourne.
What was happening there?
I think it was a BHP. They wanted to put it on the roof of the building, and it was a radio antenna of some sort, but it was pretty heavy. The difficulty was getting it up through the stairs and on top of the building.
Yeah.
And they asked ESO, since they had 50% of the ownership, could we get this aerial? It was about a 20-foot tower, I think, that had to go up there. And it needed to be plopped through the hole. They'd have riggers up there and so on. I forget which street, Collins Street or one of those up there. And of course, you couldn't do it during the day, well, working days. So we did it about 4 o'clock one Sunday morning, I think, when there was no one there. They had a semi-trailer truck. We landed just off Collins Street or somewhere. I couldn't land in the street, but we dropped the cable down. They hooked on this aerial from the the truck that was down there. Had a lot of police there, but no pedestrians around at that hour of the morning. And it just went according to plan. It was first light.
Yeah.
City's deserted. There might have been the odd night watchman around or something.
So you picked this up off the truck?
Yep. Hovered up to about the 12th floor or whatever it was. It was one of the early BHP headquarters. It's not the one they have now. Hovered along, and they had some riggers up there that fed this. I had a rigger in the back, sort of go left, go right, go left sort of thing, down, down slowly. So I was talked down. I was staring ahead. I just relying on this bloke, and it worked perfectly.
Mm-hmm. John, at the time that you ended up going to Russia...
Language was a big problem, as you can imagine. You know, they had a bit of an issue. They did have people that could sort of talk English, but they said, we're putting you up tonight at the local hospital. They're going to pick me up in the morning to drive me out to where the chopper was. And the hospital was big. I mean, it was a big sucker, ward after ward, not a soul in it. I was the only person in this whole hospital, no staff, no anything, but it was perfectly set up as a hospital. Again, I'd have to go back into my flight log to get the date of that, but it was a scary night. You're in a big hospital of about 4 wards, each ward with about 20 beds in it, operating theatre, all of this, not a soul in the whole place.
Unbelievable.
All the beds were made and everything, yeah. I think it was a disaster area set aside. They said, you don't want to stay at the hotel, we've arranged for you to have a bed at the hospital. And then they dropped me and the fella said, I'll see you at 6 in the morning. Or wrote it out, 6 in the morning. I was there by myself. I didn't sleep much.
What do you think your greatest achievement in the whole aviation industry is?
Well, probably, I suppose, where I got the Queen's Commendation, I suppose, for pulling a bloke out of the fire.
Your son,
Yeah,
Cam, he's virtually followed your footsteps.
pretty much, yeah. He's smarter than I am. He's an engineer. He's a graduate engineer, but he went through Duntroon.
Yeah, and he was with ESSO as well?
Yeah,
So he really has followed your footsteps.
pretty much. He started off with ESSO and then BHP picked him up. He didn't want to move to the States. They offered him a job, and so he's their aviation manager, but he's still travelling a lot because now BHP's worldwide. They've got other aviation advisors that report to Cam.
So he's still with BHP at this stage. All of that, John, where did you get involved in Patonk?
You know, I was in through roads, almost 100 metres across from I used to mow your bloody lawns. Yeah, just when I joined, I said, I think I took my lawnmower over. Not nearly as nice a club as far as facilities go as it is now. So we're going back about 14 years, I think.
John, thank you so very much for sharing all of that with us. I think we could probably do another 3 or 4 of these. Thank you, John. Thank you very much.
There was another achievement of John's that I wanted to include, breaking the record for the highest altitude by a single-engine helicopter. It was recorded at a different time with different equipment, and we had some tech faults, but it is so worth hearing, I'll drop it in here anyway.
The Army had the Bell 47s, as we used to call them, G2 helicopters. They were non-supercharged. They were a very basic little helicopter, could just fit 2 passengers in. They'd had those for a number of years, and I'd flown quite a bit in them. I had a couple of thousand hours on them, and as an instructor. The Army decided that they were going to upgrade that helicopter into a very advanced type, which we thought then, looking back on it, was still a pretty basic helicopter. But they were going to get a helicopter that was supercharged, that could fly at high altitude, which they needed to do operations in New Guinea. The 2 helicopters that they were considered was a Hilla 12EL, and a Bell 47 G3B1.
Now, are these still single-engine helicopters?
Yeah, to the uninitiated, they look very similar to the helicopters we already had. They were bigger, in as much as they were wider, and you could fit a pilot and 2 passengers. And they had a supercharged engine. Both the aircraft that they were considering had the same engine. was alleged by the manufacturer that they could get up to 15,000, 20,000 feet, which we didn't believe at the time. The trials were done, and the first helicopter to be tested and evaluated was the Bell 47 G3B1. I was the test pilot that was to evaluate it, and Bell sent out their chief test pilot from the States to accompany me and demonstrate and show me how it flew and show the good points that Bell wanted to be understood. The story that I was going to mention to you was the trip that we had. It was a very basic flying skill job. I saw that it flew well at low altitude, the visibility was good, there was a lot more power than we had with the original helicopters. And then I asked during the flight to the Bell representative I had on board, I said, how high will this fly with a supercharged engine? And he said, well, that's interesting, I've had it up to 18,000 feet. Sounds like a long story, and he said, yeah. He said, but I haven't taken it, I think I could even get it up higher. He said, why don't we, since we're test flying it, why don't we go up and try it? So we did. We had enough fuel on board. We started off at 18,000 feet, which was, to me, unbelievable high on a little Bell 47 helicopter, and we started to climb. The Bell performed very well. Initially, it had a 800 foot a minute rate of climb, but as we got past 20,000 feet, it slowed down considerably, as you could imagine. To both our surprise, we hit 25,000 feet and it was still climbing. We got up to 25,000 feet, which we never in our wildest dreams really expected at that height. But we were still climbing. Admittedly, it was getting down to about 100, 150 foot a minute, pretty slow. We persevered with it. At this stage it was getting pretty cold. It was about, I can't recall the outside air temperature, but it was getting around minus 15 degrees. It was very cold. We had the doors on, which helped a little bit, but not too much. But the other thing was the aircraft started to wallow, and of course neither of us really understood the effects of the low density air had on the rotating blades. The less dense air meant there was less lift from the rotor blades, and the other problem was that the stalling speed of the retreating blade, that is the blade of every rotation as it's going past and heading back towards the tail, is getting less lift than the advancing blade, which is swinging around in its rotation and picking up a higher speed. So there's a different speed between each blade, which travelling at approximately 270 revs per minute. And neither of us really understood the effects this was going to have on the aircraft. A combination of cold, I guess in my part, fear, and ignorance of what was happening to the aircraft, we decided to call it quits, and we came back and landed. But our top climb, modified for temperature, was 27,000 feet, and I'm not sure whether that was a world record. It was certainly an Australian record.
And it probably still holds today.
Well, there are very few piston helicopters flown with that. It'd be an interesting question to ask what the record is, because helicopters are really not designed for high altitudes other than high altitude countries like New Guinea and places like that. But you don't necessarily fly more than 1,000 feet or 2,000 feet above terrain.
And at that height, you'd be collecting ice.
Well, certainly you wouldn't fly at that height if there was precipitation, but even in humidity, you will get freezing on the body of the aircraft, where the cold of the steel, of the metal, will freeze the humidity in the air.
And that happened on this flight?
It certainly happened on the outside, and on the fuel tanks, cold ice was starting to form on those. Quite thick. It wasn't solid ice, it was, I call it hoar ice. It's like a non-compacted ice was starting to form, but it certainly there was enough there that was getting our attention, because I couldn't remember what the freezing point of fuel was. It was certainly well below that, but it could have been getting to that point. So we decided to call it off and log their 24,000 feet, or 27,000 feet, which I think was the highest that I'd heard of a helicopter going at that stage.
There's just two of you on board. So were there any witnesses to this?
Strangely enough, two Sabres were coming in from Williamtown, two RAAF Sabre aircraft coming to land at Amberley, which we didn't see, but they apparently saw us at 27,000 feet, and they were trying to tell the mess that night of drinks that they saw a helicopter at 27,000 feet, which was met by a huge laugh and guffaw by the rest of the officers in the mess, who thought these two guys were on the drinks and were trying to claim something that just couldn't exist.
Thank you so very much, John, for sharing just some of your story. As a bonus, our listener can hear the full audiobook version of John's life story at universalexports.co. Just follow the links in Universal Exports Podcasts. Thank you for listening. Rex out.